Carl Jung reveals why you were taught to please and can't say no. Have you ever felt like you just can't say no? Like you're always putting everyone else's needs before your own? But at what cost? What if I told you this pattern of pleasing others and sacrificing yourself is a deep psychological trap? And that Carl Jung, the most influential psychologist of all time, has the key to understanding why this happens. In this video, we'll dive into Jung's fascinating theories and reveal the truth about the people-pleasing behavior that's been keeping you from living authentically. Part 1. Understanding the origins of people-pleasing behavior. Carl Jung, a towering figure in psychology, introduced a variety of concepts that are pivotal to understanding the intricacies of human behavior. One such concept is the persona, the mask we wear in society to present ourselves in a way that is acceptable to others. For those who struggle with the inability to say no and have been taught to please, this persona can become a prison. To understand why individuals adopt such behavior, it is essential to delve deep into the early development of personality and the psychological forces that shape it. The impact of childhood conditioning. From a very young age, individuals are exposed to family dynamics, social expectations, and cultural norms that mold their personality traits. When children grow up in environments where the approval of others, especially caregivers, becomes the cornerstone of their emotional security, they learn that their worth is contingent upon making others happy. This can manifest in subtle ways, such as a child suppressing their own needs and desires to gain affection or approval. For some, the approval of a parent, especially a mother or a father who uses love as a form of conditional reinforcement, becomes a powerful motivator. In the framework of Jungian psychology, this becomes a formative experience in the development of the shadow, those parts of the self that are repressed or denied because they are considered unacceptable. The desire to please others is often a direct result of not wanting to face the fear of rejection or abandonment. Children, especially those with more emotionally unavailable or distant parents, learn that affection is not freely given but earned. This leads to the internalized belief that I must please others to be loved. The role of the good child archetype. Jung introduced the idea of archetypes universal, mythic characters that exist within the collective unconscious. One archetype that often comes into play with people pleasers is the good child archetype. This archetype is shaped by early experiences where children are praised for being obedient, helpful, and emotionally self-sufficient. These children, who often internalize these positive behaviors, feel compelled to perform them throughout their lives. The role becomes so deeply ingrained in their psyche that it shapes how they interact with the world around them. The good child archetype, however, is problematic because it prevents the individual from accessing their true, authentic self. This archetype forces people to suppress their natural desires, emotions, and instincts in favor of maintaining an image of being good or acceptable in the eyes of others. Over time, this can lead to feelings of inadequacy and frustration because the individual may feel as though they are not truly known or understood by others. This idea also ties back to Jung's concept of the persona. The persona is the outward mask that we show the world. In the case of people pleasers, the persona is built around the idea of always being agreeable, compliant, and self-sacrificing. This persona becomes so tightly woven into the fabric of their identity that it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish between who they truly are and who they have been conditioned to be. The fear of rejection and abandonment. At the root of people-pleasing behavior is often an unconscious fear of rejection or abandonment. Jungian psychology posits that the fear of being unloved or unaccepted is one of the most primal human fears. This fear can stem from early childhood experiences where love was conditional or where emotional validation was sporadic or withheld. When a child grows up with parents who show affection only when certain conditions are met, such as good behavior, academic success, or compliance with parental desires, they learn that love is a transactional experience. This can lead to the development of a subconscious belief that if they are not constantly pleasing, they will not be loved. This fear of rejection, however, becomes ingrained so deeply in the unconscious mind that it manifests in adulthood as the constant urge to appease others, even at the expense of personal well-being. Jung also emphasizes that the fear of abandonment is linked to the loss of the self in the quest to please others. The individual may neglect their own desires, dreams, and aspirations in extreme cases. This leads to a kind of emotional self-sacrifice, where the person's identity becomes defined solely by the expectations of others. As the individual continues to please others, they lose sight of their true self, ultimately feeling disconnected and fragmented. The persona as a shield. In the case of people pleasers, the persona often functions as a shield protecting them from the perceived danger of rejection and criticism by presenting an image of always being agreeable, helpful, and accommodating. They shield themselves from the vulnerability of emotional exposure. The persona becomes an armor that makes the individual appear strong, resilient, and socially adept, while hiding the inner turmoil of anxiety, guilt, and self-doubt. Jungian psychology suggests that this shield, while protective in nature, can also be limiting. It prevents individuals from exploring the full depth of their personality and engaging with their inner world. People pleasers may feel an overwhelming need to keep the peace, avoid conflict, and keep others happy, but in doing so, they suppress their own feelings of anger, frustration, or sadness. Over time, this emotional repression can lead to feelings of burnout, resentment, and even depression. Additionally, the persona often serves as a mask that distances individuals from their true desires and emotions. By continuously pleasing others, the individual may not even be aware of their own personal needs and wants. This detachment from self-awareness can be harmful, and as it prevents the individual from living authentically. The intersection of the persona and shadow. Jung's theory of the shadow, the hidden and repressed aspects of the psyche, plays a significant role in understanding why people pleasers struggle with saying no. The persona and the shadow are two sides of the same coin. The persona represents the public face, while the shadow contains the repressed traits, desires, and aspects of the self that the individual refuses to acknowledge. For people pleasers, their inability to say no often stems from a fear of confronting the shadow. Saying no requires acknowledging one's own needs and desires, and this can feel like a direct confrontation with the darker aspects of the self. The shadow contains feelings of anger, selfishness, and discontent, emotions that people pleasers often suppress in favor of maintaining a harmonious image. Jung emphasized that the integration of the shadow is necessary for personal growth. The more an individual represses these darker emotions, the more power they hold over them, ultimately influencing their behavior in ways that are often unconscious. By learning to confront and accept the shadow, individuals can begin to free themselves from the grip of the persona and start living more authentically. In this section, we've explored the origins of people-pleasing behavior, examining its roots in childhood conditioning, the role of the good child archetype, and the unconscious fear of rejection and abandonment. These forces create a powerful drive for individuals to please others at the expense of their own needs. Understanding these psychological dynamics is the first step in breaking free from the cycle of people-pleasing behavior and learning to assert one's own needs without fear of rejection or guilt. Part 2. The shadow and its role in people-pleasing behavior. In Carl Jung's framework, the shadow represents the unconscious part of the psyche where traits, desires, and instincts that are deemed socially unacceptable are repressed. The shadow encompasses all the aspects of ourselves that we do not wish to acknowledge, often because they contradict the persona we present to the world. For people pleasers, the shadow is a particularly significant force because it holds within it the emotions and behaviors they consistently deny in their quest to remain agreeable and non-confrontational. The birth of the shadow. Jung argued that the shadow is not inherently negative. It is simply the repository of everything that does not fit into the socially constructed persona of an individual. In childhood, when a child is taught that love and approval are contingent upon certain behaviors like being obedient, compliant, and people-pleasing, they begin to repress those behaviors and emotions that contradict these ideals. These repressed feelings and desires form the essence of the shadow. For example, a child who is raised in an environment where expressing anger is discouraged might learn to suppress their anger. Instead of expressing frustration, the child might engage in behaviors that make others happy, even at the cost of their own well-being. This repression of emotions and instincts builds the foundation of the shadow. And the more an individual suppresses these traits, the more the shadow grows. People-pleasing and the fear of confronting the shadow. The difficulty with people-pleasing behavior is that it directly correlates with the avoidance of the shadow. People-pleasers are often so entrenched in the need to fulfill others' expectations and needs that they deny the existence of their own personal desires, emotions, and boundaries. For these individuals, acknowledging their shadow would mean accepting parts of themselves that seem unacceptable, traits such as selfishness, anger, or assertiveness that are often seen as undesirable. The fear of facing the shadow is rooted in the unconscious belief that expressing these emotions and desires will lead to rejection, conflict, or alienation. Since people-pleasers have internalized that their worth is contingent on making others happy, the idea of confronting the shadow becomes terrifying. For them, saying no is not just about rejecting a request, it's about confronting the deeper fear of being unloved or abandoned. Jung famously said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." People-pleasers, by resisting the dark side of themselves, their anger, frustration, and desires remain trapped in an ongoing cycle of pleasing. They may fear that if they stop pleasing others, they will no longer be loved or valued. This, according to Jung, is the essence of psychological repression, the avoidance of the dark, hidden aspects of the self. The persona as a defense mechanism. The persona, as mentioned in Part 1, is the mask that individuals present to the world to gain acceptance and validation. It is not the authentic self, but rather the role one plays to fulfill social expectations. In the case of people-pleasers, the persona is often built around being agreeable, accommodating, and emotionally self-sufficient. This persona serves as a protective shield, masking the deeper insecurities, fears, and unresolved conflicts that lie in the shadow. People-pleasers wear this mask so effectively that they may lose sight of their true self. The persona becomes a defense mechanism that shields them from the pain of confronting their repressed emotions. However, this defense comes at a cost. As the persona strengthens, the individual becomes more disconnected from their authentic self, further deepening the rift between their inner desires and their outward behavior. This disconnection is a form of psychological fragmentation, where the individual feels increasingly alienated from who they truly are. Jung believed that the persona could become so rigid and entrenched that it limits personal growth. The more we identify with the persona, the less we engage with the shadow, which in turn stunts our ability to achieve true self-awareness and psychological integration. To break free from the grip of the persona, individuals must confront their shadow and allow themselves to integrate the denied aspects of their personality. The role of projection in people-pleasing. One of the key mechanisms by which the shadow operates is projection. Projection occurs when we attribute our own denied traits or emotions to others. For example, a person who has repressed their anger might unconsciously project this anger onto someone else, perceiving them as being hostile or aggressive. In the case of people-pleasers, projection can manifest in the form of resentment toward others for not appreciating their self-sacrifice or for expecting too much from them. This projection often occurs unconsciously. People-pleasers might feel overwhelmed and drained by the demands of others, yet they may not recognize that their inability to say no is the root cause of their frustration. Instead, they might blame others for being demanding or selfish, when in fact, they are projecting their own repressed desires and feelings of resentment onto others. This process of projection keeps them stuck in a cycle of self-sacrifice and unacknowledged anger. Jung believed that projection is a defense mechanism that keeps us from facing the parts of ourselves that we deem undesirable. When people-pleasers project their own anger or frustration onto others, they avoid the deeper emotional work of confronting their own repressed feelings. Instead of recognizing their own need for self-assertion, they blame others for their emotional discomfort. Projection is an unconscious attempt to protect the persona from the uncomfortable truth that the individual has suppressed their own needs and desires. Integrating the shadow, the path to authenticity. In order to move beyond the limitations of people-pleasing behavior, Jung advocated for the process of shadow integration. Shadow integration involves acknowledging the repressed aspects of the self, including those as desires, emotions, and behaviors that have been deemed unacceptable. For people pleasers, this process involves recognizing that it is not only okay but necessary to assert one's own needs, set boundaries, and express emotions such as anger and frustration. Jung argued that the integration of the shadow is a critical step in achieving individuation, the process of becoming the person one is meant to be. Individuation requires the reconciliation of all parts of the self, both light and dark. For people pleasers, this means embracing their full range of emotions, including those that might be perceived as selfish, aggressive, or demanding. By doing so, they begin to free themselves from the chains of the persona and develop a more authentic and holistic sense of self. Shadow integration does not mean acting out the repressed emotions in destructive ways, but rather acknowledging their existence and allowing them to inform healthier behaviors. For example, a person pleaser might learn to express anger in a constructive way by setting clear boundaries, rather than suppressing it and allowing it to build up until it erupts in passive-aggressive behavior or resentment. The process of integrating the shadow requires courage and self-awareness. It requires the person to confront the uncomfortable truth about themselves and take ownership of the emotions and desires they have long repressed. But through this process, they can break free from the cycle of people-pleasing and begin to live more authentically, with a deeper sense of self-respect and emotional freedom. Part 3. The fear of rejection and its influence on people-pleasing behavior. In Carl Jung's work, one of the central themes is the profound impact of unconscious fears on our behavior. Among these, the fear of rejection, whether by family, friends, or society, is one of the most primal and powerful forces shaping human actions. For the people pleaser, the fear of being rejected or abandoned is not simply a passing concern, but a deeply embedded psychological drive that influences their actions at both a conscious and unconscious level. The root of the fear: early experiences of rejection. Jung's theory emphasizes the critical role of early childhood experiences in shaping the psyche. The fear of rejection often has its roots in childhood, especially in the relationship with primary caregivers. A child who experiences emotional neglect or conditional love may develop a subconscious belief that their worth is tied to their ability to meet the needs and expectations of others. In these early years, if affection or approval is only given when the child behaves in a certain way, typically in a way that pleases others, the child may come to internalize the belief that rejection is inevitable if they fail to meet these conditions. For example, a child raised by parents who express love only when the child excels academically or behaves in a particular way may begin to feel that they are only good enough when they are pleasing others. This belief can persist into adulthood, where the person feels an overwhelming need to gain approval from others in every interaction. As a result, any hint of rejection or disapproval can trigger a deep fear and a strong desire to avoid it at all costs. This fear of rejection becomes so ingrained that it operates unconsciously, affecting the individual's decisions, actions, and relationships. The person becomes hyper-attuned to the approval of others and, in turn, starts to suppress their own needs and demands to avoid any potential conflict or rejection. The need for external validation. Jung discussed the human need for external validation as a key factor in the development of the persona. For the people pleaser, external validation becomes a lifeline. This validation often takes the form of praise, approval, or affection from others, which reinforces the individual's belief in their worth. However, this external validation is fragile and conditional, creating a vicious cycle. The more the individual relies on the approval of others, the less they are able to nurture their own internal sense of self-worth. The need for external validation can create a sense of dependency on others for emotional survival. People pleasers, therefore, often neglect to develop a solid internal framework of self-worth and confidence. Instead, their sense of self becomes intrinsically linked to the opinions and needs of others. This dynamic leaves the individual vulnerable to emotional instability. If someone withdraws approval or expresses dissatisfaction, the people pleaser feels as though their entire self-concept is at risk. Jung argued that this reliance on external validation obstructs the path toward individuation, the process of becoming one's true, authentic self. Individuals who live for the approval of others are unable to connect with their inner self, which remains suppressed under the weight of social expectations. By constantly seeking approval, they perpetuate a disconnect between their authentic self and the persona they project to the world. Rejection, sensitivity, and the fear of conflict. One of the most noticeable effects of the fear of rejection is rejection sensitivity, a heightened emotional reaction to perceived rejection or criticism. People pleasers are often highly sensitive to even minor signs of disapproval. A slight change in tone, a facial expression that suggests discontent, or a negative comment can be interpreted as a personal rejection, even when no such rejection is intended. This sensitivity leads people pleasers to engage in conflict avoidance. To prevent rejection, they go out of their way to avoid confrontation, criticism, or any situation that could challenge their approval. The fear of conflict becomes so overwhelming that they prefer to suppress their own feelings and opinions rather than risk upsetting others. The people pleaser's instinct is to maintain harmony at all costs, even if it means sacrificing their own needs, desires, or sense of identity. However, this constant avoidance of conflict leads to an ongoing internal struggle. On the surface, they may appear compliant and easygoing, but internally, they are often overwhelmed by feelings of resentment, frustration, and a sense of being misunderstood or unappreciated. Jung described this as an inner splitting between the persona and the shadow. The persona may present the image of someone who is always accommodating, calm, and agreeable, but internally, the individual may feel angry, exhausted, and disconnected from their true desires. This emotional dissonance can lead to a sense of existential emptiness. The individual is going through the motions of life, but feels no true connection to their authentic self. The role of guilt in people-pleasing. Another significant emotion tied to the fear of rejection is guilt. People-pleasers often experience guilt when they fail to meet the expectations of others. This guilt is not just a moral response to doing something wrong, but a deep emotional reaction rooted in the fear of rejection. If they fail to please others, they internalize this as a moral failing, reinforcing the belief that they are only valuable if they are meeting the needs of others. This guilt becomes a powerful motivator for people-pleasers to engage in self-sacrifice. They feel a moral obligation to put others' needs ahead of their own, even at the cost of their own well-being. The fear of guilt for rejecting someone or disappointing them becomes so overwhelming that people-pleasers may go to extreme lengths to avoid it. This cycle of guilt and people-pleasing can lead to feelings of resentment. Over time, the person may feel that they are constantly giving, but receiving little in return. However, since their worth is tied to their ability to please others, they rarely speak up or set boundaries. As a result, they may feel trapped in a never-ending cycle of emotional exhaustion. Jung suggested that guilt in this context is often rooted in unresolved emotional conflicts from early life. If the individual experienced conditional love or grew up in an environment where emotional approval was contingent upon meeting specific expectations, guilt becomes a learned response. By learning to forgive themselves and break free from the need for constant validation, individuals can begin to dismantle the cycle of guilt and people-pleasing behavior. Breaking free from the fear of rejection. The ultimate goal in addressing the fear of rejection is not to eliminate the fear entirely, but to acknowledge it and learn to live with it without allowing it to dominate one's actions. Jung believed that the path to individuation required embracing one's fears, especially the unconscious fears that drive maladaptive behaviors like people-pleasing. For people-pleasers, breaking free from the fear of rejection involves a gradual process of assertiveness training in developing a healthy sense of self-worth that is not contingent upon others' approval. It requires the individual to learn to say no without guilt, set boundaries without fear of losing love or friendship, and trust in their own inherent value, independent of others' perceptions. By facing the fear of rejection and learning to navigate social interactions authentically, people-pleasers can begin to shift their mindset. They can work on reducing the emotional charge around rejection, allowing them to handle criticism and disagreement with greater resilience. Jung's theory emphasizes the importance of self-acceptance in this process, the recognition that true self-worth comes from within, and that being true to oneself is more important than gaining external validation. Part 4. The role of the good child archetype in people-pleasing behavior. In Carl Jung's psychology, archetypes represent universal patterns that influence behavior, thought, and perception across cultures and societies. One of the most profound archetypes that shapes human development is the good child archetype, which plays a significant role in the psychology of people-pleasers. This archetype reflects the individual's early conditioning to behave in ways that are seen as good, obedient, and helpful to gain approval, often from parents or caregivers. However, the embrace of this archetype comes with significant psychological consequences that prevent the individual from truly understanding and expressing their authentic self. The formation of the good child archetype. The good child archetype is typically formed during early childhood, when children are taught that the most valuable trait they can exhibit is compliance. For many children, especially those who are emotionally sensitive or have parents who set high standards, the need to please becomes essential for receiving love, attention, or approval. The child internalizes the belief that in order to feel valued, they must act in ways that meet the expectations of authority figures. These early experiences lay the groundwork for the development of the people-pleasing behavior that continues into adulthood. For example, a child who is praised when they complete their homework on time, clean their room without being asked, or behave in a socially acceptable manner comes to believe that their worth is directly tied to their ability to meet these expectations. Over time, this belief grows stronger, and the child learns that affection and love are conditional. The result is that the child may begin to prioritize others' desires over their own, even at the cost of their well-being. The good child's fear of disappointment. The good child archetype fosters a deep-seated fear of disappointing others. People who adopt this role often fear that failure to meet others' expectations will result in rejection or emotional withdrawal. The fear of being perceived as inadequate or bad becomes so powerful that it drives them to overextend themselves in an attempt to win the approval of those around them. The desire to avoid disappointing others becomes a primary motivator for the individual, leading to a constant state of emotional hypervigilance. This fear is particularly poignant in people-pleasers who feel that if they fail to meet others' needs, they will lose the love and validation they so desperately crave. The good child archetype thus operates as a mechanism to protect the individual from experiencing the pain of emotional rejection. The more the individual strives to be good in the eyes of others, the more they lose touch with their own desires, feelings, and authentic self. The sacrifice of authenticity for approval. One of the key consequences of the good child archetype is the sacrifice of authenticity. As the individual internalizes the belief that they must constantly please others to be loved or accepted, they suppress their own desires, opinions, and emotions. Over time, they come to believe that their own needs are secondary or even irrelevant in comparison to the needs of others. This suppression of self can create a deep sense of emotional disconnect. People pleasers often feel as though they are living a life that is not entirely their own, constantly performing the role of the good child to please others. While neglecting their own wants and needs, the individual becomes so accustomed to prioritizing others that they may not even recognize what they truly desire or value. The more they try to please, the more they lose touch with their inner truth. In Jungian terms, this is a form of psychological fragmentation. The persona the mask worn to fulfill external expectations becomes a substitute for the true self. The good child archetype creates a rift between the individual's authentic self and the self they project to others. This internal fragmentation can result in feelings of anxiety, confusion, and a sense of emptiness. As the person becomes disconnected from their true identity, the good child's desire for perfection. Perfectionism is another characteristic often associated with the good child archetype. People pleasers, driven by the fear of rejection and the need to please, may believe that they must be perfect in order to be accepted. This perfectionism manifests in several ways, such as an overwhelming need to meet others' expectations, avoid making mistakes, and maintain an image of flawlessness. The desire to be perfect creates significant emotional and psychological strain. No one can consistently meet every expectation, and the pressure to do so can lead to burnout, anxiety, and feelings of inadequacy. When the good child inevitably fails to meet the impossibly high standards they set for themselves, it reinforces their deep-seated fear of rejection and disappointment. The fear of not being perfect causes people-pleasers to engage in a cycle of self-criticism and self-sacrifice, as they desperately try to maintain an image of perfection in the eyes of others. This perfectionistic drive also means that people-pleasers are often afraid of expressing their true emotions, particularly negative ones like anger or frustration. These emotions are seen as bad or unacceptable and may contradict the good image they are trying to project. As a result, the person represses these feelings, further contributing to the fragmentation of their personality. Breaking free from the good child archetype. In order to move beyond the confines of the good child archetype, individuals must begin to challenge the beliefs that have shaped their behavior. Jung's concept of individuation is particularly relevant here. Individuation is the process of becoming whole by integrating all aspects of the self, including those parts that have been repressed or denied. For people-pleasers, this means embracing their true desires, emotions, and needs, even if they feel that doing so may disappoint others. The first step in breaking free from the good child archetype is recognizing its influence. People-pleasers must learn to acknowledge the unconscious drive to gain approval and understand that their self-worth is not dependent on the validation of others. This awareness allows the individual to begin separating their authentic self from the persona they have constructed. Jung believed that confronting the archetype of the good child requires a confrontation with the shadow, the part of the self that contains repressed feelings, desires, and aspects of the personality that have been deemed unacceptable. By acknowledging the shadow, individuals can begin to reclaim the parts of themselves they have suppressed in their attempt to please others. This process involves embracing the bad parts of the self, such as anger, selfishness, and assertiveness, and learning to express them in healthy ways. One of the key aspects of breaking free from the good child archetype is learning to set boundaries. People-pleasers must recognize that it is okay to say no, to assert their own needs, and to prioritize their own well-being. Setting boundaries is a form of self-respect and self-love, and it is an essential step in reclaiming one's authentic self. The empowerment of authentic self-expression. As individuals begin to challenge the good child archetype and integrate their shadow, they move toward a more authentic expression of self. Rather than being driven by the need for approval, they start to make choices based on their own values and desires. This shift from people-pleasing to self-authentication is empowering and freeing. It allows the individual to live a life that is true to their inner essence, without being constantly controlled by external expectations. Jung believed that individuation, the integration of all parts of the self, leads to greater emotional and psychological wholeness. By embracing the full range of their emotions, desires, and needs, people-pleasers can move from a life of compliance and self-sacrifice to one of authenticity, empowerment, and inner peace. Part 5. The consequences of chronic people-pleasing, emotional exhaustion, and resentment. People-pleasing behavior, while often motivated by a desire to gain approval and avoid rejection, comes at a significant emotional cost. Over time, the continuous need to please others can lead to chronic emotional exhaustion, a sense of personal disempowerment, and deep-seated resentment. In this section, we will examine the psychological and emotional consequences of chronic people-pleasing, including how it leads to burnout, feelings of resentment, and a growing sense of disconnection from one's true self. The emotional toll of constant self-sacrifice. At its core, people-pleasing behavior involves a consistent pattern of self-sacrifice. People-pleasers prioritize the needs and desires of others over their own, often to the detriment of their own well-being. While this behavior may initially be motivated by a desire to gain approval or avoid conflict, over time, it takes an emotional toll by constantly putting others first. People-pleasers neglect their own needs, which can lead to emotional depletion and burnout. Jungian psychology highlights the importance of maintaining a balance between self-expression and the consideration of others. People who constantly sacrifice their own needs, emotions, and desires for the sake of others risk losing their sense of self. As they become more focused on pleasing others, they become increasingly disconnected from their own authentic emotions and desires. This leads to feelings of inner emptiness and exhaustion, as they are continually giving without receiving the emotional nourishment they need to thrive. Chronic self-sacrifice also means that people-pleasers are less likely to engage in self-care. They may avoid taking time for themselves, neglect their own mental and physical health, and struggle to find balance in their personal lives. Over time, this neglect of self-care can result in physical exhaustion, anxiety, and depression. People-pleasers often feel like they are running on empty, constantly striving to meet the needs of others without taking the time to replenish their own emotional resources. The emergence of resentment. One of the most common emotional consequences of chronic people-pleasing is resentment. While people-pleasers often go out of their way to help others, they may begin to feel that their efforts are not appreciated. The more they sacrifice their own needs to please others, the more they may feel that their efforts are taken for granted. This resentment often grows quietly beneath the surface, as people-pleasers may feel too guilty or fearful to express their frustrations. Over time, this unacknowledged resentment can build up and manifest in unhealthy ways. People-pleasers may become passive-aggressive, withdrawing emotionally or engaging in subtle forms of sabotage. They may harbor feelings of bitterness toward others, feeling that they are constantly giving but receiving little in return. These feelings of resentment are particularly pronounced when people-pleasers feel that others are taking advantage of their generosity or manipulating them into fulfilling unrealistic expectations. Jung argued that repressed anger often manifests as resentment. When people-pleasers suppress their feelings of frustration, anger, or resentment in an effort to avoid conflict, these emotions do not disappear. Instead, they accumulate and eventually surface in ways that may be destructive to both the individual and their relationships. Resentment can create significant emotional tension, leading to breakdowns in communication and a sense of emotional disconnection from others. Disconnection from authentic self. Chronic people-pleasing leads to a profound disconnection from the authentic self. The more an individual engages in people-pleasing behavior, the less they are able to express their true thoughts, feelings, and desires. The persona, the mask they wear to please others, becomes more rigid, and the individual loses touch with their true emotions, needs, and values. In Jungian terms, this disconnection can be understood as a form of psychological fragmentation. The persona, while useful for navigating social and familial expectations, is not a complete representation of the self. When people-pleasers become overly identified with the persona, they suppress the more authentic parts of themselves, including their desires, emotions, and personal boundaries. This disconnection from the authentic self can lead to a sense of existential emptiness. People-pleasers may feel as though they are living a life that is not truly their own, constantly performing roles and behaviors that are expected of them. They may struggle with feelings of confusion, sadness, and a lack of purpose, as they no longer feel connected to their true identity. Jungian psychology suggests that individuation, the process of integrating all aspects of the self, can help individuals reconnect with their authentic self and begin to live in alignment with their true values. The struggle with boundaries. A significant aspect of people-pleasing behavior is the inability to set and maintain healthy boundaries. Boundaries are essential for emotional well-being, as they allow individuals to define where their needs end and where the needs of others begin. Without clear boundaries, people-pleasers allow others to take advantage of their generosity, and they fail to protect their own emotional space. This lack of boundaries contributes to the emotional exhaustion and resentment that characterize chronic people-pleasing. In Jungian terms, the failure to set boundaries can be seen as a failure to individuate, to establish a clear sense of self and differentiate one's desires, emotions, and needs from those of others. People-pleasers. by constantly prioritizing others' needs, may struggle with the psychological work of individuation, which requires them to assert themselves, express their desires, and protect their emotional well-being. Setting boundaries is not only essential for maintaining emotional health, but it is also a form of self-respect. People pleasers must learn to recognize that it is okay to say no, to assert their needs, and to take care of themselves without feeling guilty or fearful of rejection. By learning to set boundaries, people pleasers can begin to create healthier, more balanced relationships with others, where mutual respect and consideration are valued. The importance of reclaiming personal power. To overcome the emotional exhaustion, resentment, and disconnection that arise from chronic people-pleasing, individuals must begin the process of reclaiming their personal power. This involves recognizing the psychological patterns that have kept them trapped in a cycle of self-sacrifice and learning to prioritize their own needs and desires. Reclaiming personal power also means taking responsibility for one's own emotional well-being and no longer relying on others' approval for validation. Jung's concept of individuation is key to this process. By engaging in the work of individuation, people pleasers can integrate all aspects of the self, including the repressed emotions and desires that have been suppressed in the service of pleasing others. This integration allows individuals to develop a more authentic, empowered sense of self and to live a life that is true to their own values and desires. Reclaiming personal power also means learning to express emotions authentically. People pleasers must recognize that it is not only acceptable but necessary to express frustration, anger, and assertiveness in healthy ways. By confronting their repressed emotions and learning to express them constructively, people pleasers can break free from the cycle of resentment and emotional exhaustion. The path to emotional healing and authenticity. Ultimately, the path to healing for people pleasers involves a deep commitment to self-awareness and self-care. Emotional healing requires confronting the fear of their rejection, releasing the need for constant validation, and learning to set healthy boundaries. It also requires the individual to embrace their true desires, feelings, and emotions, regardless of how they may be perceived by others. Jung's theory of individuation offers a pathway to emotional wholeness, where individuals are able to integrate all parts of the self, both light and dark, by embracing the full spectrum of their emotions and desires. People pleasers can break free from the constraints of the good child archetype and move toward a more authentic, empowered existence. This process of emotional healing is not easy, but it is essential for reclaiming one's true self and finding fulfillment in life. Part 6. The role of guilt and shame in people-pleasing behavior. Guilt and shame are powerful emotions that often fuel people-pleasing behavior. For many individuals, the need to please others and the inability to say no are deeply intertwined with feelings of guilt and shame. These emotions serve as internal signals, compelling the person to maintain their role as the good and obedient individual, even at the expense of their own well-being. In this section, we will explore the complex roles that guilt and shame play in people-pleasing behavior, how they are cultivated, and how they can be transformed to break free from the cycle of self-sacrifice and emotional repression. The role of guilt in people-pleasing. At its core, guilt is an emotion tied to the perception that we have violated a moral or social code, whether it's breaking a personal rule, betraying a value, or failing to meet the expectations of others. For people pleasers, guilt often arises when they feel they have let someone down or failed to live up to the expectations placed upon them. This guilt, however, is not always proportionate to the situation. Rather, it is often exaggerated, driven by the deep-seated belief that they must always meet the needs of others to be loved or accepted. The experience of guilt in people pleasers often results from fear of disappointing others or being perceived as selfish or uncaring, because people pleasers tie their sense of worth to how much they can give and how much they are loved or appreciated. The idea of saying no or asserting their own needs can feel like a moral failing. They may believe that putting themselves first is inherently wrong, or that it will cause emotional harm to others, even if those others are not asking for the sacrifices they make. In Jungian terms, guilt in this context can be seen as a reflection of repressed needs and emotions. People pleasers suppress their desires and instincts, feeling that expressing them would lead to guilt, shame, or rejection. This emotional repression creates a cycle where guilt acts as both a symptom and a reinforcement of their inability to meet their own needs. The connection between guilt and the persona. Jung's concept of the persona plays a significant role in the development of guilt in people pleasers. The persona is the mask we wear in society to present ourselves in an acceptable way, often tailored to fit external expectations and approval. For people pleasers, the persona is often built around being accommodating, self-sacrificial, and agreeable. The persona helps the individual fit into social and familial expectations and avoid the risk of rejection. However, the persona is not an authentic expression of the self, but rather a social construct designed to gain approval. Over time, the more an individual identifies with this persona, the more they suppress their true emotions and desires. The persona creates an internal conflict between what the individual feels and what they present to the world. Guilt arises when the individual perceives that they have failed to uphold this persona or have stepped outside of the role that they believe is expected of them. For example, a person who constantly puts the needs of others before their own might feel guilty when they take time for self-care or say no to a request. The act of prioritizing their own needs becomes a perceived moral violation, leading to feelings of guilt that reinforce the belief that they are not living up to the standards they have internalized. Shame and the fear of being unlovable. While guilt is often tied to specific actions or failures to meet expectations, shame is a much more pervasive and destructive emotion. Shame is related to the perception of the self as fundamentally flawed, unworthy, or unlovable. For people pleasers, shame can become an overwhelming emotion that underlies their behavior and their constant drive to please others. Jungian psychology suggests that shame is closely tied to the unconscious self, specifically the shadow people pleasers. By continuously suppressing their true emotions and desires, inadvertently project their repressed traits onto others. These repressed feelings, anger, selfishness, or desire for independence become associated with a sense of shame. People pleasers often feel that to be loved or accepted, they must hide these bad parts of themselves. The fear of being unlovable is a driving force behind the shame experienced by people pleasers. At its root, shame is the fear of being seen as fundamentally inadequate or undeserving of love. People pleasers internalize this belief, feeling that their value is entirely contingent on how well they meet the needs of others. As a result, any perceived failure to please others triggers a deep sense of shame, reinforcing the cycle of people-pleasing behavior. Breaking the cycle of guilt and shame. To break free from the cycle of guilt and shame, people pleasers must begin the process of self-forgiveness and self-compassion. Jung believed that confronting the shadow and accepting all parts of the self, both the good and the bad, is essential for psychological growth. In the context of people-pleasing, this means accepting the parts of oneself that may feel selfish or bad, such as the desire to set boundaries, to say no, or to prioritize personal needs. Self-forgiveness involves recognizing that it is natural to have personal desires and to take care of oneself, rather than feeling guilty for expressing those desires. People pleasers need to reframe their beliefs about self-care and boundaries. By accepting that setting boundaries is a form of self-respect, they can begin to release the guilt associated with asserting their needs. In addition, people pleasers must begin to challenge the belief that their worth is tied to others' approval. This requires recognizing that love and acceptance are not contingent upon always being good or meeting others' needs. Instead, self-worth must be grounded in an internal sense of value, one that is not dependent on external validation. By developing a healthy relationship with their own self-worth, people pleasers can begin to free themselves from the constant need for approval. The role of authentic self-expression in overcoming guilt and shame. A critical part of overcoming guilt and shame is learning to express oneself authentically. People pleasers often feel that expressing their true emotions, whether it's anger, frustration, or simply stating their needs, will lead to rejection or disapproval. However, embracing authentic self-expression is essential for emotional healing. Jung argued that repression of one's emotions and desires leads to emotional fragmentation and internal conflict. To heal, Individuals must learn to honor their emotions, even those that are uncomfortable or socially stigmatized. By expressing their true selves, people pleasers can begin to reclaim their emotional power and restore a sense of balance within themselves. This process may involve learning to say no without guilt, expressing anger in a healthy way, or setting boundaries without fear of being judged or abandoned. Healing from shame, the path to true self-worth. Healing from shame involves understanding that no part of the self is inherently unworthy of love. Shame often arises from the belief that there is something wrong with the self. But Jung emphasized that all aspects of the self are valuable and worthy of acceptance. By confronting shame and allowing oneself to be imperfect, people pleasers can begin the journey of self-acceptance and healing. One of the most effective ways to heal from shame is through the practice of self-compassion. This involves treating oneself with the same kindness, care, and understanding that one would offer to a close friend or loved one. People pleasers must learn to forgive themselves for past mistakes, release the need to be perfect, and embrace their imperfections. By doing so, they can gradually transform their relationship with guilt and shame, creating a more loving and accepting relationship with themselves. Part 7. The importance of setting boundaries for personal growth and emotional well-being. Setting boundaries is one of the most critical skills for breaking free from the cycle of people-pleasing behavior. For people pleasers, boundaries often feel like an impossible task. The need to please others, combined with the fear of rejection and guilt, makes setting boundaries feel threatening or even selfish. However, the ability to set healthy boundaries is essential for emotional well-being, self-respect, and personal growth. In this section, we will explore the importance of boundaries, why people pleasers struggle to set them, and how learning to establish boundaries can lead to healthier relationships and greater self-empowerment. The role of boundaries in emotional health. Boundaries are the invisible lines that define where one person's emotional space ends and another's begins. They are essential for maintaining healthy relationships and protecting one's emotional, mental, and physical well-being. Setting boundaries involves understanding and asserting what is acceptable and what is not in terms of how others treat us, as well as recognizing and respecting our own needs and desires. From a Jungian perspective, boundaries are an essential part of the individuation process, which involves developing a clear and integrated sense of self. Without boundaries, individuals cannot fully differentiate themselves from others or assert their own needs. Boundaries allow individuals to maintain their emotional integrity while still engaging meaningfully with others. They are an essential element of self-respect, and without them, people pleasers risk losing themselves in the process of constantly accommodating others. Healthy boundaries are not about rejecting others or being cold or distant. Instead, they are about honoring one's own needs and values while respecting those of others. People pleasers, in particular, need to learn that saying no is not an act of rejection, but a necessary part of self-care. By establishing boundaries, individuals can engage in relationships from a place of balance and mutual respect, rather than from a place of emotional depletion. Why people pleasers struggle with boundaries. People pleasers often struggle with boundaries because they fear conflict, rejection, and guilt. The idea of saying no or refusing a request feels terrifying because it threatens their deeply ingrained belief that their worth is tied to their ability to make others happy. The fear of disappointing others often overrides the need for personal well-being. As a result, people pleasers end up sacrificing their own needs in favor of others, which leads to emotional exhaustion, resentment, and a loss of personal identity. One of the core reasons people pleasers struggle with boundaries is that they are often taught from a young age that their value is tied to their ability to please others. This lesson is reinforced by parental figures, teachers, or caregivers who may unintentionally condition the child to seek approval through compliance. The more a person internalizes this belief, the more difficult it becomes to assert their own needs. Setting boundaries feels like a threat to the identity they have built around being the good person who always puts others first. Jung's concept of the persona plays a key role here. The persona is the mask people wear to fit into society and meet external expectations. For people pleasers, the persona is built around the idea of being helpful, accommodating, and agreeable. When people pleasers attempt to set boundaries, it feels as if they are breaking free from the persona, which is an uncomfortable and unfamiliar experience. This fear of losing the persona of no longer being seen as good or acceptable can prevent them from setting boundaries and asserting themselves. The psychological benefits of setting boundaries. Learning to set boundaries has profound psychological benefits. First and foremost, it allows individuals to maintain their emotional energy and well-being. People pleasers often feel drained and exhausted because they are constantly giving of themselves without receiving the same level of care or respect in return. By setting boundaries, they can protect their emotional resources, ensuring they have enough energy to take care of themselves and engage in relationships that are mutually respectful and supportive. Setting boundaries also helps to reduce resentment. When people pleasers say yes out of guilt or fear, they often feel resentful and frustrated, especially if they are unable to meet their own needs in the process. By asserting boundaries, people pleasers can avoid the buildup of unacknowledged anger and frustration, allowing for healthier, more authentic interactions with others. Additionally, boundaries promote self-respect. When individuals set clear limits and communicate their needs, they demonstrate to themselves and others that they value their own emotional health and well-being. This helps to foster a sense of personal empowerment as the individual takes control of their life and choices. Setting boundaries requires assertiveness, the ability to express one's feelings and needs clearly and confidently without fear of rejection or guilt. From a Jungian perspective, the ability to set boundaries is a key step in the process of individuation becoming more authentic and self-aware. When individuals establish healthy boundaries, they are asserting their own identity and sense of self, rather than conforming to external expectations. This process of self-assertion is essential for emotional growth, self-empowerment, and the development of a healthy, integrated self. How to start setting boundaries. Setting boundaries is a skill that can be developed over time. For people pleasers, it may initially feel uncomfortable or even unnatural. However, by practicing and reinforcing healthy boundary setting, individuals can begin to break free from the cycle of people-pleasing and regain control over their emotional lives. Here are some steps to start setting boundaries. Identify your needs. The first step in setting boundaries is recognizing what you need. This requires an honest self-assessment of your emotional and physical needs. Ask yourself, what do I need to feel respected and cared for? What do I need to feel safe and comfortable in relationships? People pleasers often neglect their own needs in favor of others, so this step involves reconnecting with your inner desires. Learn to say no. One of the most difficult but essential boundary setting skills is learning to say no. Saying no does not mean rejecting someone. It means asserting your own needs. Practice saying no in a calm and confident manner. Without guilt or hesitation, remember that it is okay to turn down requests that do not align with your needs or values. Be clear and direct when setting boundaries. Be clear and direct about what you need. Avoid passive-aggressive behavior or indirect communication, as this can lead to confusion and frustration. Communicate your boundaries assertively but respectfully, without apologizing for having them. Deal with pushback. People pleasers may face resistance when they begin to set boundaries, especially from individuals who are used to their compliance. It is important to stand firm and not give in to guilt or manipulation. Practice reinforcing your boundaries with compassion and confidence, knowing that you are prioritizing your own well-being. Practice self-compassion. Setting boundaries can bring up feelings of guilt, fear, or anxiety. It is important to be kind to yourself during this process. Remind yourself that setting boundaries is a necessary act of self-care and self-respect, not a selfish or unkind act. Seek support. If you struggle to set boundaries on your own, seek support from friends, family, or a therapist. Talking about your struggles with boundary setting can help you gain clarity and build confidence in your ability to assert yourself. The transformation from people-pleasing to self-assertion. The journey from people-pleasing to healthy self-assertion is one of the most empowering transformations a person can make. By learning to set boundaries, people pleasers can reclaim their personal power, restore emotional balance, and build more authentic, fulfilling relationships. Boundaries allow individuals to live from a place of integrity, where they are no longer sacrificing their own needs to gain approval or avoid rejection. Jung's concept of individuation offers a guiding framework for this transformation. By confronting the unconscious fears and beliefs that fuel people-pleasing behavior, such as the fear of rejection, guilt, and the need for external validation, individuals can begin to integrate their authentic selves and develop a healthier relationship with both themselves and others. Ultimately, setting boundaries is about embracing self-love, self-respect, and self-empowerment. When people-pleasers learn to assert their needs and desires, they not only protect their emotional well-being, but also create the space for true intimacy and connection in their relationships. Boundaries allow individuals to engage with others from a place of authenticity and mutual respect, rather than from a place of fear, guilt, or obligation. Part 8. Reclaiming authenticity and living a fulfilled life beyond people-pleasing. In the final part of our exploration of people-pleasing behavior and its psychological underpinnings, we focus on the ultimate goal of overcoming people-pleasing patterns, reclaiming authenticity, and living a life that is aligned with one's true self. While learning to set boundaries and manage guilt and shame are essential steps in this process, the ultimate transformation comes when individuals can fully embrace who they are, unburdened by the need to constantly please others. Reclaiming authenticity means living a life that is rooted in one's own values, desires, and purpose, rather than one dictated by external expectations. The power of authentic self-expression. Authenticity is the cornerstone of psychological freedom and personal empowerment. When people-pleasers break free from the cycle of self-sacrifice and constant approval-seeking, they are able to rediscover their true selves, those parts of them that have long been suppressed in the service of pleasing others. The journey to authenticity begins with self-awareness, the understanding of who we are at our core, beyond the roles we play and the personas we project. Jung believed that authenticity is achieved through individuation, the process of integrating all parts of the self, including both the light and shadow aspects of our personality. Authenticity is not about being perfect. It is about being whole, accepting and embracing all aspects of our being. This includes recognizing and accepting the parts of ourselves that we may have rejected or denied in the past, such as anger, selfishness, or assertiveness. To live authentically, people must learn to express their true emotions, desires, and needs without fear of judgment or rejection. Authentic self-expression involves being honest with oneself and others about what we want, what we need, and how we feel. When people-pleasers embrace this form of self-expression, they begin to experience a sense of liberation. They no longer feel the need to wear a mask or perform a role to gain approval. Instead, they can show up in the world as their true selves, fully engaged in relationships that are based on mutual respect and understanding. Building a life based on core values. One of the key steps in reclaiming authenticity is identifying and living by one's core values. People-pleasers often operate from a place of external validation, aligning their actions with the expectations of others rather than their own values. As they shift from people-pleasing to authenticity, they must take the time to reflect on what truly matters to them. What do they value most in life? What are their passions, dreams, and goals? Living in alignment with one's values requires a deep sense of self-awareness and the courage to make choices that reflect those values, even if they go against the grain of societal or familial expectations. It also involves learning to say no to things that do not align with one's values, whether it be toxic relationships, draining commitments, or situations that compromise one's sense of self. Jung emphasized the importance of living authentically, as it leads to greater psychological wholeness. When people align their actions with their values, they experience a sense of inner harmony and integrity. This sense of alignment fosters a deep sense of purpose, as individuals feel that their lives are meaningful and connected to something larger than just fulfilling the expectations of others. The role of self-compassion in overcoming people-pleasing. The journey from people-pleasing to authenticity is not without challenges, but self-compassion plays a crucial role in the healing process. People pleasers often struggle with feelings of guilt and shame when they begin to assert themselves and prioritize their own needs. However, self-compassion allows them to navigate these feelings without self-judgment. Self-compassion involves treating oneself with kindness and understanding. Rather than criticism or condemnation, it means acknowledging that it is okay to make mistakes, to be imperfect, and to have needs that are just as important as those of others. By practicing self-compassion, people pleasers can begin to quiet the inner critic that tells them they must constantly give in to others' demands in order to be worthy of love and acceptance. Jung's concept of self-acceptance is key here. As individuals embrace their authentic selves, they must also accept their flaws, limitations, and imperfections. Self-compassion allows individuals to step out of the cycle of perfectionism and people-pleasing by recognizing that they do not need to earn love or approval. They are inherently worthy of it just as they are. Healthy relationships and emotional balance. One of the greatest rewards of reclaiming authenticity is the ability to form healthy relationships. People pleasers often struggle with relationships because they are so focused on meeting the needs of others that they neglect their own emotional needs. As a result, their relationships may be unbalanced, with little reciprocity or mutual respect. By setting boundaries, expressing their true feelings, and living according to their values, people pleasers can begin to cultivate relationships that are based on mutual respect and equality. These relationships are not driven by fear of rejection or the need to please, but by genuine connection and shared values. As people pleasers begin to live more authentically, they will find that their relationships become more meaningful, fulfilling, and emotionally nourishing. Jung believed that the journey to wholeness requires both individuation and connection with others. While individuation involves integrating the inner self, healthy relationships provide the external support and interaction that foster emotional growth. By cultivating authentic relationships, people pleasers can enhance their emotional well-being, creating a balanced life that includes both independence and connection. Living a fulfilled life beyond people-pleasing. Ultimately, the goal of overcoming people-pleasing behavior is to live a fulfilled and authentic life, a life that is driven by one's true desires, values, and purpose. Rather than by the need for external validation, this process requires ongoing self-awareness, self-compassion, and assertiveness. It also involves recognizing and confronting the fears and beliefs that have kept individuals trapped in the cycle of pleasing others. Jung's teachings emphasize the importance of embracing both the light and shadow aspects of the self. By doing so, individuals can break free from the constraints of the good child archetype, the persona, and the limiting beliefs that have shaped their behavior. When people pleasers begin to live authentically, they no longer feel the need to seek approval from others or sacrifice their own needs. Instead, they create lives that are meaningful, aligned with their values, and full of emotional and personal growth. Embracing change and moving forward. As individuals reclaim their authenticity, they also embrace change, the change that comes with breaking free from the shackles of people-pleasing behavior. This change is often uncomfortable at first, as it involves confronting the fears and insecurities that have held them back. However, it is through this discomfort that true personal transformation occurs. The more people pleasers assert themselves, express their needs, and live in alignment with their values, the more they experience emotional freedom and fulfillment. Jung believed that embracing change was essential to psychological growth. He argued that only by confronting and integrating our unconscious fears, desires, and beliefs can we achieve wholeness and become fully alive. For people pleasers, embracing this change means living a life that is true to who they are, rather than who they think they should be. It is the ultimate expression of personal empowerment and emotional freedom. Thank you for watching. I hope Carl Jung's insights on people-pleasing have helped you understand the deeper psychological patterns at play and inspired you to start reclaiming your authentic self. Remember, setting boundaries and embracing your true desires is not selfish. It's necessary for your emotional well-being and personal growth. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with others who might benefit, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. And of course, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on more deep dives into psychology and personal transformation. Stay empowered, embrace your authenticity, and remember you are enough just as you are. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep growing.